So what's up? Now we're going to be doing the next video, which is going to be the Industrial Revolution and how it changed the world. So throughout history, there's been two major revolutions. There's been many, don't get me wrong, but in this sense, there was the Agricultural Revolution, which brought us from like stone tools to like
stone tools.
whatever. There's the Agricultural Revolution, and now we're at the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to start off with
The Agricultural Revolution is part of the Industrial Revolution.
So the Industrial Revolution was in Britain, and we're going to start off with why was it in Britain and sort of the nature behind it. By the way, this was in the late 1700s. So Britain had many natural resources like coal, like iron. They were on the coast, surrounded by water, which was used to power a lot of the machinery. So this sort of shows some environmental determinism, which is like a human geography term actually. So it's basically saying that where Britain got lucky with where they were. If they were somewhere else, who knows if they would have been the first place to industrialize. And it sort of shows how sometimes your environment can determine your fate. So Britain also at this time, they had a stable government, they had a parliament system, they weren't going through revolutions like France. And the thing is, when you don't have to worry about trivial things like revolution, when you don't have to worry about things like revolutions and where you're going to get your next food supply from, it's a lot easier to start focusing on developing your cities and developing your technology.
They had surpluses and all that.
100%. They had surpluses of resources. They had a growing population due to the agricultural revolution. They had more food. They had an intensive labor force, and honestly, they were wealthy enough to invest in these machines. And they had access to global trade. They had routes everywhere, especially because they were on the ocean. So it sort of shows how they were lucky with where they were.
They were also able to take risks, even if the Industrial Revolution was a big failure.
They were stable enough, exactly. And this all started with farming, with the enclosure movement, which forced small farmers off their land, but it did boost food production. And more food meant more people, and more people meant more workers for the new factories. So
also the population shift.
Yeah.
I knew it, right?
The what?
The population shift.
Yeah, the population was increasing due to a surplus in food.
Also, the people went from the farms to the cities.
Oh yeah, you're saying migration, yeah. Because there was now a surplus in food, less farmers were needed, so people were able to migrate to cities and instead put the labor force into factories and industrial jobs. So now we get into the nitty-gritty. So the first invention we're talking about is the steam engine, which was improved by James Watt, because technically it did exist. And it powered all the machines that were used. It powered ships, it powered trains. But the thing is, the steam engine and a lot of other things here relied on water to run.
And
coal.
That's also why Britain was good, is because they had a lot of coal.
So it goes back to that. Now,
that is why a bunch of the cities, especially British cities, are near rivers and other bodies of water.
So then the real first aspect that was affected was the textile industry, because at first that's like clothing, people were hand weaving their clothes, knitting it, sewing it, but now due to like the steam engine and many of the machines that were being made, the spinning jenny was one of them, the power loom, these sped up the production of clothing by an extreme amount.
The production, and it made things more uniform, like you know what you're gonna get, you know exactly how it's gonna be, it's not gonna be better.
There was consistency, there was consistency, increased production.
Yeah. Think of modernization, I feel like that's a big theme.
100%.
Industrialism, but also modernization.
Yeah. So iron was being smelted, way more efficiency, and eventually steel. So
that's another revolution, right? That's not on here. The steel revolution was after the textile revolution.
yeah, so I don't know if you guys remember Mao Zedong and the backyard furnaces. He had people smelting their forks and knives to try and reach these steel quotas, because now he wanted to keep up with Britain. But the thing is, when you're 200 years ahead, it's hard to keep up.
What? What do you mean behind?
Oh yeah, when you're 200 years behind, it's hard to keep up. So steel was eventually created using the Bessemer process, and steel became the symbol of industrial power. So
So the reason why steel was so good is because it wasn't that much heavier, but it had a lot more strength.
yeah, exactly. It was a similar weight to iron, but the sturdiness of it was much better. So now the factories, the machines weren't breaking as often. The boats were stronger and able to get through rougher seas, and the people, even just everyday items like forks and knives, were better quality.
Just modernization.
So
And that also kind of affects a lot of other things, like imperialism. People were able to come into Africa because they had the necessary things.
exactly. So now we get into like the next sort of mini revolution was the transportation revolution. Wait, I'll wait. Take your time.
Better. Oh yeah, higher buildings, especially because that's how people kept up
Yes.
with the growing populations in the cities.
Yep.
I'm gonna add population. Shut up.
Go ahead.
It.
So yeah, just to talk a little bit more about that, the steel revolution allowed built houses and apartments to be built. So now instead of expanding outward, the cities could expand upward, which is why we see New York City with all these skyscrapers during their industrial revolution. So now we get into the transportation revolution, which had canals, steamships, and railroads that moved goods and people faster than ever. So not only did steel contribute to things like we said before, now they're contributing to the building of railroads and, as I said, boats. So now, instead of taking months to get goods from one place to another, or taking months to go see your family, it would take weeks or sometimes even days.
And it also allowed people to get to other places. You think of also another thing, globalization.
Yeah, globalization for sure, which is like everyone sort of joining together.
Yeah, it really just the spread of ideas.
Yeah.
And you have to walk to somewhere, but it's much easier for you to take the train.
And it was honestly an insane difference because now you're going from a few months to a few days, and even if it's a short distance, a few hours. That was revolutionary at the time, and it really had drastic effects for the people. So now, just to talk a little bit about what life was like and the factory system. So,
Not all this was positive, but
of course, work, it moved from farms and homes to factories, and to be honest, this changed the. You're good?
yeah.
This changed people's lives
Yeah.
because now they had long hours. They were working,
Yeah.
like now you think a 9 to 5 is bad. These people were working 12, 14-hour
Yeah.
days. And it's not that they were getting compensated fairly. There was no minimum wage. These people were making very little amounts of
And again-
money. And if you said, oh, I'm not making enough money, they're going to find someone who's willing to get paid that little and who's just going to take your job.
because it was the standard, and it was the standard to have this, and that was your only option.
People
Especially because they were in the cities, they were originally in the farms, but with those that more technology and farming, then they didn't need as much people anymore.
And the people didn't have enough stability to try and uprise and ask
Yeah.
for more. So they kind of just settled with it. They all were okay with it.
And the government was hands off.
Yeah, oh yes, that's actually very important. Laissez-faire capitalism, it means that you guys do your thing, the government's not gonna get involved. It's the complete opposite of like communism. They just wanted to see where things go. They're not gonna interfere, but that's awful because now everything's unfair. There's no regulations, there's no minimum wage, there's no hour limits. These people, they were working in extremely dangerous conditions. People were dying and getting injured, and when you got injured, you didn't get paid time off. No, you got replaced, and you now were back looking for work.
Out of a job, out of an home.
Exactly. So people crowded into these cities looking for jobs. It was an insane urbanization, and families, they were now forced to live in tenements,
Yeah.
which were
Yeah.
dirty
Horrible.
houses. They were cramped. These people were. There was probably like 8 people in a room at a point
Yeah,
because
standard of living. I mean, you think, well, eventually it glasses over, but kind of in the beginning when things were they still kind of roughing out the edges, there were a lot of bad things that were going on. The standard of
Yeah.
living really decreased, but then that did allow for things to get sorted out, and then it's kind of like this. I think of it like this. So you have normal, and then it goes down a little bit, but then you're at a higher.
exactly.
Yeah.
You got to go down to go up. So while the quality of living did decrease for a bit, eventually it did have positive effects.
Yeah.
So now,
Haves for have-nots.
not yet. A new middle class was created. So earlier, as we've spoken about a million times, we had the peasant farmers and the royalty. Now there's this new middle working class, which was called the bourgeoisie, as we said in the French Revolution. This was factory owners, this was bankers, merchants who got rich. So these were everyone that was wealthy, but not exactly royalty,
Yeah.
but not exactly peasants.
They were, they could be even richer, but as far as the status goes, they were below. Even though they
So it sort of started to show the very two different worlds. There was the wealthy, and then the proletarians, which was the working class. And as Mr. Mavani always says, the haves versus the have-nots. Some people had, some people didn't, and it wasn't very fair. So with all these changes came new ideas. So we start off with Adam Smith. He was a huge supporter of laissez-faire capitalism, and he's part of the reason that all these things happened. But then we have Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, and they said that helping the poor would make things worse. So they sort of agreed that you just have to, they sort of thought distinctive classes they're inevitable and they're actually good for society and they're not something you should try to fix. So not everyone agreed. Do you want to speak a little?
Yeah, my hands tired.
Yeah, you're there.
Where are we? Utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham said that society should work for the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which again was backing the proletariat. Because as we saw with the French Revolution earlier, even though what was it, like 97% of the population, but they were taxed, they were represented the least. A socialist, you think socialism? I think of it as like a ramp. You have socialism, and then Marxism, and then communism, kind of like an extremity. Yeah, love that. Karl Marx, that was at this time.
Karl Marx was the starter of all communism and all socialism. He is what led to a lot of future problems that the world faces.
We talked about this. We didn't talk about oil, but that's fine.
Okay, so wait, no.
That's fine. No, because we already talked about it. We already talked about steel and electricity and assembly line.
Okay. Oh wait, should we talk about? Yeah, we have to talk about that. So, do you guys remember the utopian socialism sort of thing? What was it? It was.
So, it's hard. It's hard to fix these problems. And in theory, a great solution to this was a utopia where everything was really closely monitored by the government and everyone was seen as equal. But as you know, we've read plenty of books about that.
So, Karl Marx, he had scientific socialism, which was socialism with like a little bit of thought behind it. He thought that the working class people were going to rise up and overthrow the proletariat, which was that middle class, and sort of get the rights that they deserve. And eventually he was right, there were revolts. So now we get into the second industrial revolution. Yeah, we talked a lot about steel, but just to mention, dynamite was made by Alfred Nobel. Does that name sound familiar? The Nobel Peace Prize was named after him. There was electricity and light bulbs, which was Thomas Edison. The assembly line, which was, do you guys, example?
Cars.
It helped production. It's like, let's say that's a wheel.
Henry Ford invented the car and the assembly line.
Yeah, so the assembly line is like, let's say that's a wheel, we're just passing it down.
So I make these two, and then Trevor puts it together.
I would put it together, and now I'd pass it off to somebody else who's going to attach it to the car.
Specialization.
It was specialization. People were able to do what they were good at.
Yeah, exactly, and that leads to choice.
Choice as well, yeah. But it also increased efficiency significantly.
Yeah.
So now there were new business methods because we're getting into sort of some ideas of capitalism. There's a lot here, wow. There were corporations, there were stocks, there were monopolies. I don't know if you know what a monopoly is, but it's when you have a control over an item,
You think of Monopoly. When you have a Monopoly, you have the whole color set, which means that you own everything in that area. So you can jack the price up as much as you want to, and people can't say no, because that's the only thing that they are available.
I was the only person who knew how to make Crocs. I was sitting next to wearing them. And I was now the only person who sold Crocs, and everyone had, let's just say there was no other shoes in the world, and there was only Crocs. I can make the prices $100, and people had to buy it because they had nowhere else to go. That's what a monopoly was like.
But then when they implemented reforms, then they had people that sold shoes like these, and then since this is $10 and that's $1,000, they would buy these instead, and it would cause everything to kind of balance out.
So now cartels started to form, which was groups of companies controlling entire markets. So it was sort of like
Not
the
cartel you're thinking.
Yeah, it was like the two of us coming together to have a monopoly over the shoe business and finding a fair price, like $20, instead of having one person. It was sort of a group. So honestly, the economy was booming, industry was booming, but the workers were still struggling.
Until.
So now we have the reform and change.
So again, originally, if you want to draw that graph again,
What graph?
the little graph I had, it was really cool.
Of what?
I got it. So this thing.
Oh yeah, down and then up.
So right now we're here, right? And you need different reforms,
To get up there.
government reforms to get up there. Now,
So no more laissez-faire capitalism.
the U.S. has laissez-faire capitalism, but that is with some. It's a tiny laissez-faire capitalism. It's with some guidelines. They created labor unions, which was groups of people, and what's the thing called when they stop working?
Strikes.
Strikes were a thing. But, strikes were pretty bad in the economy. People. Say there was a strike in a shoe business, now people don't have shoes, right? It's really bad. So what they did is that they had these labor unions so they could organize stuff without having to go on strike, without having to go through these radical measures. The Sadler report exposed child labor in British factories, because also there's a moral part of this. You don't want to buy shoes where there are little kids skating away. You'd rather buy shoes, kind of like with blood diamonds as well.
We talked a little bit about the dangerous conditions.
Yeah.
This report, it exposed really how bad it was. There were children at the age of 10 working 10-hour days in gaseous conditions that were giving them diseases, and they were sort of exposed.
Yeah. So eventually, right, they passed laws to protect these lives. And again, they also created boundaries. You had to get paid this certain amount. You could only work this certain amount. That's why minimum wage started here. And you could only work a blank hour week. But there's still a lot of struggle that happened before that. Yeah. I think that's.
So it sort of shows this. Yeah, I can't write anything. So this revolution, it changed the world. Honestly, it brought people from. It didn't even change the world just technologically, but it also introduced a lot of these reforms that are still used in the United States economy today.
Mm-hmm.
So next video, we're going to be doing Japan's modernization.
Before human rights is also a big thing. I feel like that people's human rights, workers' human rights, were really weren't. Help me out here.
What do you say?
Human rights, people weren't represented.
Yeah.
And with these reforms, then they were able
The government did not protect
to
the
go back to
people.
that standard. Yeah.
So next is going to be Japan and imperialism in Southeast Asia.